Welcome class to the Art of Story lecture, Mars 1020 at Cuyahoga Community College. This lecture is on the three-act structure. The three-act structure is a story structure that we find present in screenplays, commercials, public service announcements, documentaries, and even corporate promotional videos. The three-act structure follows in what we've already learned in this class in understanding Aristotle to state that the really strongest plays during his time had a very strong beginning, middle, and end. We also discussed Jean-Luc Godard's quote, "Every good story must have a beginning, middle, and end, but not always in that order." And what that means when it comes to the three-act structure, or the insight that it gives us into the three-act structure, is that your acts don't always have to follow chronological order of the story. So when we say that there's a beginning, middle, and end to a story, we may tell the middle of the story first, we may tell the end of the story in the middle, and we may give the beginning of the story at the end. You're always going to have how your film opens, what happens during the duration of your film, and how your film closes. But in those different parts, you may choose where in the story you're going to tell. So when we see a three-act structure, we are divided into three acts. We have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Now you may choose to put the beginning of your film in Act 1, and the middle of your story in Act 2, and the end of your story in Act 3. That is a linear story structure. Linear means that you're telling the story chronologically. So you're in chronological order from the beginning, the middle, to the end. However, as Jean-Luc Godard points out, we don't always have to have the beginning of the story in Act 1. We will always have Act 1 as Act 1, but Act 1 may tell the end of the story. And Act 2 may tell the beginning of the story. And Act 3 may tell the middle of the story. If you choose to shuffle like cards, your beginning, your middle, and end of the story into your different Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, then you are telling your story in a non-linear structure. A non-linear structure simply means out of chronological order. So, that being said, we have to then understand what then makes Act 1, Act 1. If the beginning of the story doesn't make Act 1, Act 1, if the middle of the story could be Act 1, then what makes Act 1, Act 1? And what makes Act 2, and Act 3, Act 3? What we want to remember is our definition of act is the completion of a dramatic arc. The completion of a dramatic arc is our definition for an act. So that means that there must be a part of this dramatic arc that must be completed in Act 1, and a different part of that arc that must be completed in Act 2, and a different part of the arc that must be completed in Act 3. So we want to know what are the components of an Act 1 arc, what are the components of the Act 2 arc, and what are the components of the Act 3 arc. We're going to take a look at that right now. So, filmmakers are visual. So we oftentimes will create images to help us really understand what we're doing. And you'll see the same thing in our three-act structure. There actually is a story arc that's drawn out and plotted. It almost looks like a graph line. And that's something that we use to just kind of visually get an understanding for where we are. Also, the history of this three-act structure, this arc that I'm going to draw out for us and understand the components of it, come from feature films. But they don't just exist in feature films. We find the same three-act structure applied in commercials. We find it applied in documentaries, in promos, and in narrative music videos. Why do they all come from the feature film structure? That's simply because feature films are the oldest form of motion picture in this country. So the first time that we saw filmmakers doing or creating this arc, they were filmmakers, they were feature filmmakers. But we still see that commercial filmmakers follow the same arc. They find this arc to be the strongest for them. Again, this is like Aristotle. This roadmap wasn't plotted out without someone having walked this path first. It's not a sort of projection of how to write a story. It's looking back at how strong stories have been written and sort of putting together the breadcrumbs of the path that had been walked and seeing how that path was shaped out and marked. So again, this is like Aristotle, where we're looking at what great storytellers, what great playwrights had done in the past, what great filmmakers have done in the past, and finding the commonality. using and learning from their commonalities to then sort of help us as we begin to craft really strong films. Act 1. The arc for Act 1 looks pretty much like just a straight line as we're moving from the status quo and on into the call to action. I'm actually going to lower my line just a little bit to give myself more space on the dry erase board as this arc will get higher in our more exciting moments of the story. So it's pretty much a straight line moving upward. And this is launching us into the dramatic action of the film. Our first story point is the status quo. Each point that I draw on this arc is a story point. So we have the 3-act structure story arc, which is going to be the green line, and then we have our story points, which will be in blue. The first point of the story is the status quo. We want to understand the world as it is, the world of this story as it is. Every time you begin a new story, you're introducing your audience into a new world. And when we introduce our audience into a new world, we need to set that world for them, set up the world that we're in. Give them a sense of the time, the space that we're telling our story within. Many times that's a known time and space. You're telling a story that takes place in the 1990s of, Cleveland, Ohio. So for your audience, they pretty much know Cleveland, Ohio in the 1990s. But you may be telling a story that takes place in the 18th century, the 18th century Britain. And so you're looking at, the middle of the thrust of the colonial period. And so Britain has a lot of conversation about their colonies in the U.S. and their colonies in the west coast of Africa and colonies in the Caribbean and Australia at that time. And so you'll want to introduce someone who may not be exactly familiar with that time period. Your opening, your status quo is really an event, a scene that allows you to establish the setting that we're in. So what you're going to do, a task for Act 1, is to establish the setting. In establishing the setting, you are going to establish the time period and the place. So the time period includes everything down to June 2nd, 1865, which that's going to give us a real sense of globally what period of time we're in. But we also need to give a space because June 2nd, 1865 in Britain means any time in the 19th century coming off of being in the middle or the beginning or being in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. But 1865, June 2nd, in Atlanta, Georgia, marks the day that the Civil War ended. And so for that group of people, for that location, this is a major day for them. This is a day in which through the grapevine, through telegraph and letters, people are learning that they are freed now. So this is a huge moment. But that's where setting is always going to be time and space. We can have our time, but without knowing exactly that space, it can mean the difference between a June 2nd, which is a hugely, expressive day for, Atlanta, Georgia for that place, and June 2nd, 1865 may not be a hugely expressive day for London, Britain. For them, it's just any other day in the middle of their, Industrial Revolution. So this is where you want to understand that setting has both time and space. You are establishing, when you're establishing setting, the time period that we're in and the space that we are in. A lot of ways to introduce or establish setting for a filmmaker is obviously going to be images. What are people wearing? What's the landscape behind them to establish the place? How do people speak? How do people carry themselves? All those concrete things that we learned, the 5 senses, to see, to hear, to taste, to smell, and to touch. You're going to use concrete language to describe the sights, the sounds, the smells, the taste, and the touch of the world, of the setting at this particular time, in this particular space. That's how you're going to establish setting. The other thing you're going to do in your scene, because each one of these story points is a scene in your film. Remember, scene is something that takes place in the same time and the same space. So we're in the kitchen in the morning. Your scene that you decide that's going to be your story point for status quo, you're going to actually, within one space, introduce us to the time setting that we're in, the time period we're in, and the space that we're in, the regional space we're in. So you're going to do that with images. You may choose that if you were to tell a film that takes place, at the end of the Civil War, you may choose that your scene that's going to be your status quo point, where you're establishing the time period and the space, is going to be a slave cabin in Atlanta, Georgia. So you're now going to have a telegraph come in. That's the scenery. You may shoot a shot, your establishing shot right before you go inside the slave cabin is going to be maybe cotton fields with the huge white plantation house in the background. And then we push into our slave cabin. Now we're inside our slave cabin, so we're inside the scene that matches with the status quo, and you're going to have the space, the way it looks, the details of how it tastes, how it smells, how it sounds. You're going to give all those concrete languages for this space, and that's going to let us know where we are, what time period we're in, and where we are. So you're not going to establish these things the way maybe a novelist would establish it. Well, a novelist's first line of their chapter could be June 2nd, 1865, Atlanta, Georgia. We're not going to do that because we're visual. We're creating images. We're creating images that move. So we need to establish this time and space with visuals. And like I said, that shot of the plantation with the cotton plantation, the field, and then the plantation house, the big white, Neo-Greco architecture to it, and then this small little cabin on the edge of the property that looks, small and shabby in comparison. That's a visual that expresses a great deal. Then when you get inside of that cabin, what we see, the utensils, how rudimentary it is, that's also, if we see shackles on the side, that's going to start to give us a sense of setting, and those are all images. We can even express the smell. If there's a dusty smell, you can see the dust coming up off the dusty floor. We can see maybe even it's going to have a different smell to it if we also see, that there is a pig pen right there next to it. So all of those things or even inside, all of those things are going to give us those tactile, concrete language, sensory images. So that's how you want to actually establish these things. The other thing